About 5 years ago, I worked the graveyard shift as a forklift operator at a distribution warehouse in Montana. The job was straightforward but grueling, especially during the winter, when the cold seemed to seep into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. The warehouse was massive, with towering shelves of inventory that stretched up into the dim, fluorescent lighting. It was always quiet at night, just the hum of machinery and the occasional crackle of the PA system. That night, it was just me and 2 other guys on the shift. Carlos was in shipping, packing up pallets near the loading dock, and Pete was up in the office handling paperwork. I was stationed near the far end of the warehouse, stacking crates onto shelves. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I first noticed it. As I backed my forklift into position, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. A quick flash of motion in the narrow aisle between 2 shelves. I turned my head, but nothing was there. I shrugged it off. The warehouse was full of shadows, and after hours of monotonous work, your mind starts playing tricks on you. A few minutes later, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just movement. I thought I heard something too. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on one of the metal shelves. I killed the engine on my forklift and listened. The tapping stopped. "Carlos?" I called out, my voice echoing through the cavernous space. No response. Feeling uneasy, I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the aisle where I thought I'd seen the movement. The beam cut through the dim light, illuminating row after row of boxes, but nothing looked out of place. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from farther down the aisle, just out of sight. I followed the sound, my boots crunching on the cold concrete floor. As I rounded the corner, my flashlight caught something on the ground. A single glove, lying in the middle of the aisle. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't standard warehouse gear either. It looked old, the leather cracked and worn, like something you'd find at a thrift shop. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand, my stomach twisting with unease. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable. Boot prints in the thin layer of dust that coated the concrete. They led away from me, deeper into the warehouse, toward the loading dock. I followed them, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the dock, Carlos wasn't there. His workstation was empty, the pallet jack abandoned in the middle of the floor. "Carlos?" I called out again, my voice cracking. Still nothing. The only sound was the wind howling outside, rattling the massive metal doors. Then I saw it. The chain on the side door was unlatched, the door slightly ajar. Snow had blown in, scattering across the concrete in delicate drifts. I stepped closer, peering through the crack into the icy darkness outside. The footprints continued, disappearing into the snow-covered lot. My gut told me not to follow, but I couldn't leave Carlos out there. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cold hitting me like a slap. The footprints were easy to follow at first, but the wind was picking up, erasing them almost as quickly as I could track them. They led around the side of the building, toward the abandoned loading bay we hadn't used in years. As I rounded the corner, my flashlight flickered and went out. I slapped it against my hand, cursing, but it didn't come back on. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Deep, labored breaths, just a few feet away from me. "Carlos?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind. The breathing stopped. I turned and ran, slipping and stumbling on the icy pavement until I made it back to the main entrance. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my chest heaving. When I got back to the office, Pete was on the phone with the police. He said he'd heard shouting from the loading dock and had gone to check on Carlos, but he couldn't find him. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. They searched the property and the surrounding woods, but didn't find any sign of Carlos or anyone else. The next day, the warehouse manager reviewed the security footage. The cameras had caught something, a man in a heavy coat and boots walking through the loading dock around 2:30 a.m. He didn't work there, and no one recognized him. Carlos was never found. I quit the job a week later. This happened about a year ago when I was driving back home from visiting my family for the holidays. It was late, probably close to midnight, and I was traveling alone. My route took me through some pretty rural areas where rest stops were few and far between. The weather had been steadily getting worse as the night went on, with snow falling so heavily that my visibility was down to a few car lengths. After about 2 hours on the road, I was desperate for a break. My back was stiff and I needed a stretch. I finally spotted a rest stop sign through the flurries. It wasn't much, just a small building with a couple of vending machines, a few parking spaces, and an empty lot surrounded by trees. But at that moment, it felt like a godsend. When I pulled in, there were no other cars around, which wasn't surprising given the weather. I parked close to the entrance, left the car running to keep it warm, and hurried inside. The place was freezing, with fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. It smelled like damp concrete and stale coffee. I quickly used the restroom, grabbed a snack from the vending machine, and was about to head back to my car when I heard the sound of a door creaking. I froze. It wasn't the bathroom door. I was standing right next to it, and it was still shut. The sound had come from somewhere deeper in the building, near a hallway marked "Staff Only." "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the tile walls. No response. I thought about leaving right then, but something made me linger. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just didn't want to believe someone else was actually there. I walked toward the hallway, my boots squeaking against the wet floor. The door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I decided I wasn't sticking around to find out what was behind that door. I turned and hurried back toward the entrance. As I stepped outside, I glanced toward my car and stopped dead in my tracks. There was someone sitting in the driver's seat. My heart shot into my throat. The engine was still running, and the headlights cut through the falling snow, but I could see a figure slouched in the seat, their face obscured by the shadows. I didn't know what to do. My phone was in the car, so I couldn't call for help, and the rest stop was in the middle of nowhere. For a second, I just stood there, my breath fogging up in the cold air. Then, the figure turned their head. Even with the glare from the headlights, I could make out their face. It was a man, probably in his 40s, with greasy hair and a crooked grin. He stared at me through the windshield, like he was daring me to come closer. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. That's when I heard it, the creak of the staff door behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The door was now wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. I didn't wait to see what was going to happen next. I ran toward the road, slipping on the icy pavement, and flagged down the first car I saw. The driver, an older man in a pickup truck, pulled over, and I frantically explained what had happened. By the time we drove back to the rest stop, my car was gone. The police were called, and they found my car a few miles down the road, abandoned in a ditch. The inside had been ransacked, but nothing was missing except my phone and the cash I'd left in the cup holder. To this day, I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I'd gone straight to my car instead of hesitating. That man had to have been waiting for me, watching me the entire time I was inside. Now, whenever I'm driving late at night, I avoid rest stops altogether. It's just not worth the risk. Last winter, I picked up extra hours at a small convenience store on the edge of town. It wasn't a bad gig. Quiet most nights, just me behind the counter and a few late-night regulars grabbing snacks or gas. The store was in a rural area, right off the highway, so we stayed open 24/7 for truckers or anyone else passing through. This particular night, a snowstorm had swept in fast. By 11 p.m., the roads were nearly deserted, and I hadn't seen a customer in over an hour. The snow was coming down so hard, it looked like a solid white sheet under the parking lot lights. I kept myself busy restocking shelves and counting down the till. Around midnight, I heard the chime of the front door. I glanced up, expecting one of the usuals, but it wasn't anyone I recognized. A man stepped inside, brushing snow off his jacket. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a beanie pulled low and a scarf covering the lower half of his face. His eyes locked onto mine for a beat before he turned toward the coffee machines. "Cold out there," I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond, just nodded slightly as he poured a cup of coffee. Something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he moved, slow and deliberate, or how he kept glancing over his shoulder. When he brought the coffee to the counter, I noticed his hands were red and raw from the cold, shaking slightly as he reached for his wallet. He paid in cash, crumpling the bills into my hand without a word. "You need directions or anything?" I asked, trying to keep it light. "No," he said, his voice flat. He picked up his coffee and headed back toward the door, but he didn't leave. Instead, he stopped just inside the entrance, staring out into the storm. I could see his reflection in the glass, his eyes darting back and forth like he was watching for something. "Everything okay?" I asked, my nerves starting to creep up. He didn't answer right away. Then he turned slightly, just enough for me to catch his expression, a mix of fear and something else I couldn't place. "You've got a back door, right?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. Yeah, why?" "Lock it," he said, his tone sharp. "What?" He stepped closer to the counter, lowering his voice. "Lock it. Now." My stomach tightened. I wanted to ask what was going on, but the look in his eyes stopped me. Without another word, I grabbed the keys from under the counter and headed to the back. The back door led to a small loading area, where the snow had already piled up against the frame. I twisted the deadbolt, making sure it was secure, then hurried back to the front. The man was still there, standing by the counter now, his coffee untouched. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my effort to sound calm. He hesitated, then said, "Someone's following me." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Following you?" I repeated. He nodded, glancing toward the window. "I've been driving since dusk. Every time I stopped, they stopped. Every time I pulled over, they waited. I thought I lost them in the storm, but..." He trailed off, his eyes fixed on something outside. I followed his gaze. The snow obscured most of the parking lot, but through the haze, I saw headlights approaching. A car was pulling in slowly, its tires crunching over the icy pavement. "That them?" I whispered. He didn't answer, but the way he tensed told me all I needed to know. The car, a dark sedan, rolled to a stop near the pumps. The engine idled, but no one got out. The man backed away from the window, his breathing quickening. "Do you have a place to hide?" What? No, The chime of the door cut me off. Another man stepped inside, this one shorter, stockier, with a heavy coat and a hood that cast his face in shadow. He walked toward the counter, his boots leaving wet tracks on the floor. "Cold night," he said, his voice calm and easy. I nodded stiffly, glancing at the first man, who had edged closer to the coffee station, keeping his back to the wall. "Just stopping for gas," the new guy said, pulling out his wallet. "You open all night?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. He paid for the gas in cash, then looked around the store, his gaze lingering on the first man. "Quiet out here," he said, almost to himself. The tension in the air was suffocating. The first man stood frozen, his eyes locked on the counter. Finally, the second man gave a short nod. "Stay warm," he said, turning toward the door. He stepped outside, but he didn't go to his car. Instead, he leaned against the hood, lighting a cigarette and watching the store. The first man cursed under his breath. "He's waiting." "For what?" "Me," he said. My mind raced. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. "Do you want me to call the cops?" He shook his head. "They'll be gone before they get here." He glanced toward the back, then back at me. "Is there another way out?" "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, we just stood there, the storm raging outside, the man by the car still watching. Finally, the first man straightened, his jaw set. "Thanks for the coffee," he said, his tone almost resigned. Before I could say anything, he walked out into the snow. I watched as he climbed into his truck and started the engine. The sedan's headlights flicked on immediately, and the car followed him as he pulled out of the lot and disappeared into the storm. I never saw either of them again. But sometimes, when I'm closing up at night, I catch myself glancing at the parking lot, half expecting to see headlights waiting in the snow.